The smell of charcoal and overpriced cologne hung thick in the August air as I stood beside the barbecue station, watching Pierce Eldrow work the crowd like a politician at a fundraiser. The annual company picnic was in full swing at Lakeview Park, complete with white tents, catered food, and enough corporate networking to make my skin crawl. I'm Lennon Brasken, and to everyone here, I'm just Mira's husband, the guy who shows up to these things in khakis and a polo shirt while the real players discuss quarterly projections and merger opportunities. They see a consulting contractor, maybe some mid-level tech support. Nobody bothers to look deeper. That's exactly how I like it. Pierce approached the grill with that swagger he'd perfected over his 3 years as regional director. Designer sunglasses, Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than most people's rent, and a smile that screamed entitlement. He grabbed a beer from the ice bucket and positioned himself next to me, close enough that I could smell his expensive aftershave. "Great turnout this year," he said, not really talking to me, but performing for the small audience of junior executives nearby. "A company's doing better than ever. Of course, that's what happens when you have the right people in the right positions." I nodded politely and flipped a burger. Pierce had that look in his eyes, the one that meant he was about to say something he thought was clever. "You know, Lennon," he continued, voice dropping to what he probably thought was a confidential tone, "Mira tells me everything about the business, even things she'd never tell you." The spatula felt heavy in my hand. Around us, conversations continued, someone laughing about golf scores, another group debating the best restaurants downtown, normal picnic chatter. But Pierce's words hung in the air between us like smoke. He took a long sip of his beer, clearly pleased with himself. It's nice having that kind of trust with a colleague, that level of intimacy in professional relationships. I set down the spatula and turned to face him fully. Pierce was grinning now, thinking he'd delivered some kind of devastating blow. The junior executives were pretending not to listen while hanging on every word. "That's interesting, Pierce," I said, keeping my voice level and friendly. "Did she tell you I own 60% of this company?" The grin froze on his face. The beer bottle stopped halfway to his lips. Around us, the conversations didn't pause, but I caught a couple of sideways glances from the nearby executives. "What?" Pierce's voice cracked slightly. "Brasken Holdings," I explained, still smiling. "Shell company I set up when your founders came begging for Series B funding 3 years ago. Right around the time you got promoted to regional director, actually. Funny how that timing worked out." Pierce's tan seemed to fade a shade or two. He glanced around as if looking for an escape route, but we were surrounded by his colleagues, his subordinates, his entire professional world. Mira never mentioned. Why would she?" I shrugged and picked up the spatula again. "She knows I prefer to stay in the background. A little less complicated that way. Though I do appreciate you letting me know about those intimate professional conversations. Very illuminating." I could practically see the wheels turning in Pierce's head as he tried to process this information. How many times had he bragged about having inside knowledge? How many company secrets had he assumed were his to share? "Listen, Lennon, I think there might be some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding." I flipped another burger, the sizzle loud in the sudden quiet between us. 60% ownership, Pierce. That means I approve your salary, your bonuses, your vacation requests. Every quarterly review that determines whether you keep that corner office. Pierce's hand was shaking slightly as he set down his beer. The junior executives had found reasons to drift away from our conversation, suddenly very interested in the dessert table. "I should go find Mira," he stammered. "Good idea," I agreed. "Maybe ask her about those things she tells you that she'd never tell me. I'm curious to hear what makes the list." He walked away quickly, weaving through the crowd with none of his earlier swagger. I watched him go, then returned my attention to the grill. The burgers were perfect, charred on the outside, juicy in the middle. My phone buzzed with a text from Tommy Bell, my old friend who ran a bar downtown. "How's the corporate circus?" I typed back, "Just getting started." The thing about being underestimated is that people tell you things they shouldn't. They make assumptions about what you know, what you can do, what you're willing to do. Pierce had just made a very expensive assumption. I'd been suspicious about Mira's late nights at the office, her sudden interest in after-work networking events, the way she'd started guarding her phone like state secrets. But Pierce's little performance at the grill had just confirmed what I'd been trying not to believe. My wife was sharing more than quarterly projections with her regional director. The question now was what else Pierce knew, and more importantly, what he'd done with that information. Because if there's one thing I'd learned in 15 years of business, it's that pillow talk has a way of turning into profit margins. And I was about to find out exactly how profitable Pierce Eldrow had made my marriage. The ride home from the picnic was quiet. Mira sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, occasionally making small comments about the food or the weather. Normal spouse conversation, the kind that fills space without saying anything meaningful. But I kept thinking about Pierce's smirk, the way he'd positioned himself next to me like he was claiming territory, the casual arrogance of someone who thought he held all the cards. Pierce seemed friendly today, I said as we pulled into our driveway. Mira looked up from her phone. Did he? I barely talked to him. Too busy with the Henderson account discussions. He mentioned you two have been having a lot of professional conversations lately? Well, yes. He's regional director. We work together on most major projects. Her tone was matter of fact, but she'd gone back to her phone screen. Why? Just curious about the company dynamics, since I'm technically invested in the success. She laughed, but it sounded forced. Your consulting fees hardly count as investment, Lennon, though I appreciate you taking an interest. I parked in the garage and sat there for a moment after turning off the engine. Mira was already unbuckling her seatbelt, eager to get inside and away from this conversation. Mira, I said quietly. What? Brasken Holdings. Ring any bells? She paused with her hand on the door handle. Should it? It's the shell company that owns controlling interest in your firm. Has for 3 years now. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Mira's reflection in the passenger window showed confusion, then something that might have been recognition. That's impossible, she said finally. The Series B funding came from venture capital. Morrison and Associates handled the whole thing. Morrison and Associates represented Brasken Holdings. I'm Brasken Holdings. She turned to face me fully now, her expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something approaching anger. You're telling me you own the company I work for? 60%. Your founders were 3 weeks from bankruptcy when they came to Morrison looking for emergency funding. I'd been tracking the firm's potential for months through industry contacts. Good reputation, solid client base, just terrible cash flow management. But the paperwork, the legal documents, I reviewed everything as part of the senior staff briefings. Shell company, remember? All the documents show Brasken Holdings as the primary investor. You never asked Morrison who was behind Brasken Holdings. Mira was staring at me like I just told her I was secretly an astronaut. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted you to succeed on your own merits. Having your husband as the majority shareholder tends to complicate workplace dynamics. Complicate? She shook her head. Lennon, do you have any idea how this looks? How this makes me look? Depends on what you've been doing with company information. The question hung in the air between us. Mira's face went through several expressions before settling on defensive. What's that supposed to mean? Pierce seemed very confident about his access to inside information today, made some interesting comments about the intimate nature of your professional relationship. Pierce is an arrogant jerk who thinks every conversation is flirtation. If he's misinterpreting professional discussions, what kind of professional discussions? The usual. Project timelines, client concerns, budget allocations, nothing that isn't covered in the weekly staff meetings. I nodded slowly. What about the Henderson merger talks? The Riverside Development Project? The Executive Compensation Review? Each item on my list made Mira's expression tighten a little more. These weren't topics covered in weekly staff meetings. These were boardroom discussions, senior leadership decisions, the kind of information that required clearance levels she didn't have, unless someone was sharing it with her. How do you know about those projects? She asked. Because I approve them. Every major decision goes through Morrison to Brasken Holdings for final authorization. I've been signing off on your company's direction for 3 years. This is insane. Mira got out of the car and headed for the house. I followed, watching her body language shift from confusion to anger to something that looked like panic. In the kitchen, she poured herself a large glass of wine and stood at the counter with her back to me. So what happens now? She asked. You fire me, dissolve the company, punish everyone because you're having trust issues? I'm not having trust issues, Mira. I'm having information security issues. She spun around. Meaning what? Meaning someone in your company has been sharing confidential information with outside parties. Someone with access to executive decisions and strategic planning. Someone who knows about projects that haven't been announced to general staff. And you think that's me. I think someone's been telling Pierce Eldrow things he shouldn't know, and Pierce was very confident about his source today. Mira took a long sip of wine, and I could see her thinking through the implications. If Pierce had been sharing information with competitors, if he'd been trading on inside knowledge, if there was any kind of securities violation. I need to make some phone calls, she said finally. To who? My attorney, HR, maybe Morrison and Associates to verify this whole ownership story. Good idea. While you're at it, you might want to review your recent conversations with Pierce. Try to remember exactly what kind of professional intimacy you've been sharing. She set down the wine glass hard enough to make it ring against the granite counter. I have never done anything inappropriate with Pierce Eldrow or anyone else at the company. If you can't trust me after 15 years of marriage, this isn't about trust, Mira. This is about business, and someone's been conducting business with my company's confidential information. I left her standing in the kitchen and went to my home office. Time to review some emails and see exactly what Pierce Eldrow had been doing with his intimate professional knowledge. Because if he'd been trading on inside information, his resignation letter was going to be the least of his problems. My home office is nothing fancy. A desk, 2 monitors, and a filing cabinet that contains more secrets than most people would believe. I keep the important documents in digital format, encrypted and backed up to 3 different secure servers. The paper files are mostly decoys, but they make the room look properly businesslike when Mira occasionally wanders in. Tonight, she was staying downstairs with her wine and her phone calls. I could hear her voice through the floor, alternating between angry and pleading tones as she worked through her contact list. Let her make all the calls she wanted. The documentation I was about to review would speak louder than any conversation. I logged into the secure server that housed my monitoring systems. When you own 60% of a company, you have certain rights regarding information security. When that company handles multi-million-dollar construction projects and development deals, those rights become responsibilities. 3 years ago, when I'd rescued Mira's firm from bankruptcy, I'd insisted on comprehensive digital monitoring as part of the investment agreement. Email servers, phone logs, internet activity, all of it filtered through security protocols that flagged unusual patterns or potential breaches. The system had been running quietly in the background ever since, generating weekly reports that usually contained nothing more interesting than excessive social media usage and the occasional personal email sent from company accounts. But tonight, I was looking for something specific. I pulled up Pierce Eldrow's communication logs for the past 18 months. Email, phone calls, text messages sent through company devices, all of it legally monitored and recorded as part of the employment agreement he'd signed when he became regional director. The first red flag appeared immediately. Pierce had been in regular contact with Marcus Chen, CEO of Riverside Development Group. Not unusual by itself, Riverside was a competitor, but the construction industry involved a lot of crossover relationships. Subcontractors worked for multiple firms, suppliers maintained relationships across the market, and executives occasionally moved between companies. But the timing of these conversations was interesting. On March 15th, Pierce had sent a text to Chen, "Henderson project looking good. Numbers better than expected." On March 16th, Riverside had submitted a last-minute bid for the Henderson project that undercut our proposal by exactly 3%. On April 8th, Pierce had called Chen and talked for 27 minutes. On April 9th, our client had received an anonymous tip that our lead contractor had safety violations on a previous project. The tip was false, but it delayed our project approval by 2 weeks. On May 22nd, Pierce had sent another text. "Executive comp review next week. Expect changes." On May 24th, 3 of our senior project managers had received job offers from Riverside Development Group. The pattern was clear, documented, and absolutely damning. But it got worse. I cross-referenced Pierce's communications with internal company data. Every piece of information he'd shared with Chen corresponded to confidential discussions that had taken place in senior leadership meetings that Pierce, as regional director, shouldn't have had access to, unless someone was briefing him afterward. I pulled up the meeting schedules and compared them to Pierce's email activity. The timeline was perfect. Senior leadership meeting on Monday morning, Pierce's communication with Chen by Tuesday evening, executive strategy session on Wednesday, Pierce's update to his contact by Thursday. Someone was feeding him information with remarkable consistency. I opened a new search parameter and looked for communication patterns between Pierce and internal company personnel. Most of his internal emails were routine, project updates, meeting confirmations, standard workplace coordination, but his text message logs told a different story. Pierce had been exchanging personal texts with Mira for 8 months. Not through company devices, but the security system tracked personal phone usage when connected to company Wi-Fi networks. The messages started professionally enough. Project discussions, client concerns, scheduling coordination. But by month 3, the tone had shifted. "Thanks for the heads up about the Henderson timeline. You're always looking out for me. Dinner meeting ran late again. Wish I was having dinner with better company. Can't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday. You understand the business better than anyone." And then, 2 weeks ago, "What would I do without our private briefings? You tell me things I never hear in the official meetings?" I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. The evidence was all there, documented and time-stamped. Mira had been sharing confidential information with Pierce. Pierce had been trading that information to a competitor, and both of them had been stupid enough to leave a digital trail. My phone rang. Tommy Bell's name appeared on the screen. "How did the corporate picnic turn out?" he asked. "Educational," I said. "Very educational." "That doesn't sound good." "Pierce Eldrow has been selling company secrets to Riverside Development Group for 18 months, and my wife has been his source." Tommy was quiet for a moment. He'd been a cop for 20 years before opening his bar, and he understood the difference between suspicion and evidence. "You sure about this?" "Digital records, communication logs, trading patterns that correspond to internal meetings. It's all documented." "What are you going to do?" I looked at the evidence files on my screen, then at the door to my office where I could still hear Mira's voice downstairs. "I'm going to call an emergency board meeting for Monday morning, and then I'm going to watch Pierce Eldrow's world fall apart." "And Mira?" "Mira made her choice 8 months ago. She just didn't know I'd be keeping score." I hung up and started preparing the presentation that would end Pierce Eldrow's career. The evidence was comprehensive, the pattern was clear, and the consequences were going to be swift and permanent. By Monday afternoon, Pierce would understand exactly what kind of intimate professional relationship he'd been having with my wife, and by Tuesday, he'd be explaining it to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that makes everything look like a crime scene. I sat in my home office at 7:30 a.m., reviewing the presentation one final time before the 9 a.m. emergency board meeting. 43 slides of evidence, communication logs, financial records, and timeline correlations that painted a picture no reasonable person could dispute. Mira had left early for the office, claiming she needed to prepare for a client meeting. She'd been distant all weekend, taking phone calls in the other room and spending hours on her laptop with the screen angled away from me. Whatever damage control she was attempting, it was too late. The evidence was already in motion. I'd sent the board meeting notification Sunday evening to all 5 board members, along with Morrison and Associates' senior partner and the company's legal counsel. The agenda was simple: information security breach. Executive action required. At 8:45 a.m., I logged into the secure video conference system and watched the participants join one by one. Board members appeared in their home offices and corporate conference rooms, looking appropriately serious for an emergency Monday morning meeting. Morrison appeared at 8:58, his expression grim. He'd reviewed the preliminary evidence I'd sent him Sunday night. "Good morning, everyone," I began once all participants were connected. "Thank you for making time on short notice. We have a significant security breach that requires immediate executive action." I shared my screen and launched the presentation. 18 months ago, someone in our organization began sharing confidential information with Riverside Development Group. This information included project timelines, budget allocations, strategic planning discussions, and executive decision-making that allowed Riverside to systematically undercut our bids and target our personnel. The first slides showed the pattern of lost contracts, the suspicious timing of competitor actions, and the financial impact on company operations. The total cost to our organization has been approximately $2.3 million in lost revenue and increased operational expenses. Board member Janet Harrison leaned forward on her camera. "Do we know who's responsible?" "Yes. Regional Director Pierce Eldrow has been in regular communication with Riverside CEO Marcus Chen. These communications consistently preceded competitive actions by Riverside." I clicked to the next slide, showing Pierce's communication logs with timestamps. Every piece of shared information corresponds to confidential discussions from senior leadership meetings that Pierce, as regional director, was not authorized to attend. "Then how was he getting the information?" asked board member Tom Kellerman. I paused at this slide. The evidence was clear, but the personal implications were about to become very public. Pierce was receiving briefings from someone with senior leadership access, someone who attended these meetings and then shared the details in private conversations. I clicked to the next slide, showing the text message logs between Pierce and Mira. The silence on the video call was absolute. Morrison cleared his throat. "Lennon, I think we should discuss this privately before—" "No." My voice was steady, professional. "This is a board matter now. The security breach involves a senior staff member who has been compromising company operations for personal reasons." I continued through the slides, showing the escalation of personal messages between Pierce and Mira, the correlation between their private meetings and Pierce's subsequent communications with Riverside, and the financial damage caused by their collaboration. The evidence shows systematic information sharing over an 8-month period, resulting in lost contracts, compromised negotiations, and strategic disadvantages that have cost the company significant revenue. Legal counsel spoke up. What's our exposure here? Are we looking at securities violations? Pierce's communications with Riverside include information that could constitute insider trading if any stock transactions were involved. We'll need to review his financial records and coordinate with regulatory authorities. And the internal source? Janet Harrison's voice was carefully neutral. Will be terminated immediately and referred for legal action if warranted. I could see the board members exchanging glances on their cameras. Everyone understood the personal dynamics at play, but this was business now. I recommend we accept Pierce Eldrow's resignation effective immediately, terminate his access to all company systems, and begin legal proceedings to recover damages from both Pierce and Riverside Development Group. Has Pierce submitted a resignation? Tom Kellerman asked. He will by end of business today. Morrison nodded grimly. I'll handle the legal documentation and coordinate with regulatory authorities. This level of systematic information sharing definitely warrants SEC review. What about the internal source? Janet asked again. I looked directly into my camera. Mira Callan will be terminated for cause effective immediately. Her access to company systems has already been suspended. The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, covering legal procedures, damage assessment, and communication strategies. But the essential business was complete. Pierce Eldrow's career was over. Riverside Development Group was about to face a federal investigation, and Mira's professional reputation was destroyed. At 10:15 a.m., I closed the video conference and sat back in my chair. My phone was already ringing. Mira's name on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. By noon, Pierce's resignation letter would be on Morrison's desk. By Tuesday, the SEC investigation would be underway. By the end of the week, the industry would know exactly what happened to executives who traded company secrets for personal gain. The intimate professional relationship between Pierce Eldrow and my wife had just become a very public business lesson, and I was just getting started. The first domino fell at 11:47 a.m. when Pierce's resignation email arrived in Morrison's inbox. I was copied on the message, along with the entire board and legal counsel. The tone was professionally desperate. Effective immediately, I resigned from my position as regional director. I acknowledge that recent communications may have created conflicts of interest and apologize for any misunderstandings. I request confidentiality regarding the circumstances of my departure and waive any claims to severance or compensation beyond my final paycheck. Morrison forwarded the message to me with a single line. Too late for damage control. He was right. By the time Pierce realized the scope of his exposure, the regulatory machinery was already in motion. At 1:15 p.m., my phone rang. SEC investigator Lisa Park, someone I'd worked with on previous industry compliance issues. Lennon, I received Morrison's preliminary report about potential securities violations. This looks serious. It is serious. 18 months of systematic information sharing with a competitor, resulting in market manipulation and financial damage. We'll need access to all communication records, financial documents, and trading information for both Pierce Eldrow and any associated parties. Everything's already compiled and ready for transfer. Digital forensics, communication logs, financial impact analysis. What about Riverside Development Group? Any indication they knew the information source? I pulled up the evidence files on my screen. Marcus Chen's communications with Pierce show clear awareness that the information was confidential. Multiple references to inside knowledge and private sources. That's conspiracy to commit securities fraud. We'll be opening a full investigation into both individuals and Riverside's trading patterns. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, covering evidence procedures, witness interviews, and timeline coordination. By the end of the call, Pierce Eldrow and Marcus Chen were facing federal criminal charges, and Riverside Development Group was about to undergo comprehensive regulatory scrutiny. At 2:30 p.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Janet Harrison from the board. Lennon, we've been discussing the situation with legal counsel. There are some concerns about the personal aspects of this case. What kind of concerns? Mira's termination, the public exposure of the affair, the potential for wrongful termination claims. I'd been expecting this conversation. Board members get nervous when personal and professional issues intersect, especially when regulatory investigations are involved. Mira violated her employment agreement by sharing confidential information with unauthorized personnel. She compromised company security for personal reasons. The termination is justified regardless of any personal relationship. But the evidence gathering, the monitoring systems, the level of surveillance, it could look like you were targeting her specifically. I was targeting information security breaches. The monitoring systems have been in place for 3 years and apply to all personnel. The evidence speaks for itself. Janet was quiet for a moment. What if she claims the monitoring was retaliation for marital problems? Then she'll have to explain why she was sharing company secrets with Pierce Eldrow for 8 months. The timeline shows the information sharing began before any marital issues, and the pattern is consistent with deliberate corporate espionage. Morrison thinks we're legally solid, but he's concerned about publicity. Let him be concerned. This is a textbook case of corporate information theft. The personal aspects are irrelevant to the business violations. After hanging up, I checked the industry news feeds. Word was already spreading through professional networks. Pierce Eldrow's sudden departure from regional director, the emergency board meeting, the rumors about regulatory investigation. The construction and development community was small enough that news traveled fast. By 4 p.m., 3 different industry publications had called requesting comments. I referred them all to Morrison and Associates. At 5:30 p.m., Tommy Bell called. Heard through the grapevine that Pierce Eldrow cleaned out his office this afternoon, security escort and everything. Word travels fast. Faster when it involves federal investigators showing up at Riverside Development Group. Marcus Chen's having a very bad day. I wasn't surprised. SEC investigations move quickly when the evidence is comprehensive and the violations are clear. What about Mira? Haven't heard from her since this morning. Her office was cleared out by 3 p.m. She's probably meeting with attorneys, trying to figure out damage control. Is there any? I looked at the evidence files still open on my computer screen. Communication logs, financial records, regulatory reports, timeline correlations that painted a picture of systematic corporate betrayal. Not for Pierce or Marcus Chen. They're facing federal charges and industry blacklisting. Their careers are over. And Mira? Mira made her choice 8 months ago. She chose to share company secrets with Pierce Eldrow instead of protecting the business that employed her. Now she gets to live with the consequences. That's cold, even for you. It's business, Tommy. Personal relationships don't excuse corporate espionage. But as I hung up the phone, I realized the personal aspects were just beginning. The regulatory cascade had destroyed Pierce's career and was about to destroy Riverside Development Group. The professional consequences were swift and permanent. The personal reckoning was going to take longer, and it was going to be much more complicated. Tuesday morning brought clarity. I reviewed overnight developments while the SEC investigation accelerated faster than expected. Pierce Eldrow and Marcus Chen had retained criminal defense attorneys, and Riverside Development Group stock dropped 12% after the investigation leaked. The real damage came from the industry reaction. Construction is a closed ecosystem. Once trust is broken, word spreads instantly. Pierce's name became toxic overnight. By 8:30, Morrison confirmed multiple companies were calling, not to hire Pierce, but to ask whether they should be worried. He told them Pierce Eldrow was under active SEC investigation for securities fraud and corporate espionage. That ended his job search. No major firm would touch someone facing federal charges. At 10 a.m., David Chen, Marcus's brother and Riverside's legal counsel, called to discuss resolution. He offered financial compensation and NDAs, framing the espionage as misinterpreted communications. I rejected that outright and laid out the terms: full restitution, public acknowledgement of the theft, and a permanent agreement barring Riverside from bidding against us. They had until Friday. After that, full criminal and civil action. By afternoon, Tommy Bell confirmed the fallout. 6 companies had pulled Pierce's resume. Others were warning partners to stay away. Industry forums were already circulating threads titled Pierce Eldrow, avoid at all costs. Even if charges were reduced, Pierce's career was finished. In this industry, trading corporate secrets is unforgivable, and reputation damage is permanent. And Marcus Chen? Riverside Development Group is hemorrhaging clients. 3 major projects were canceled yesterday, and 2 more are under review. Their bonding company is requiring additional collateral because of the investigation. I nodded. The industry response was exactly what I'd expected. Construction and development depend on trust relationships, and violations of that trust carry permanent consequences. What about Mira? Haven't heard much. She's keeping a low profile, probably on legal advice. Smart move, though it won't help her career prospects. You think she'll find another position? I considered the question. Mira's involvement was less public than Pierce's, but the industry connections would make her association with the scandal well known among potential employers. Not in this region. Maybe not anywhere in construction and development. Corporate espionage tends to follow people throughout their careers. Tommy looked at me carefully. You realize you've destroyed 3 careers in 2 days. I documented corporate espionage and reported it to appropriate authorities. The career destruction is a natural consequence of their choices. Still cold. Still business. But as Tommy left and I returned to my computer, I realized the professional erasure was nearly complete. Pierce Eldrow would never work in the industry again. Marcus Chen and Riverside Development Group were facing bankruptcy, and Mira's career in architecture and development was effectively over. The regulatory cascade had accomplished in 48 hours what might have taken years through normal market competition, and I was just getting started with the personal reckoning. Wednesday evening, Mira finally came home. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard her car in the driveway. She'd been staying at her sister's house since Monday, communicating only through attorneys and brief text messages about practical matters. Tonight was the first time we'd been in the same room since the board meeting destroyed her career. She looked exhausted. The confident professional demeanor that had defined her for 15 years was gone, replaced by something fragile and uncertain. She set her purse on the counter and stood there like she wasn't sure she belonged in her own kitchen. "We need to talk," she said. I continued stirring the pasta sauce. "About what?" "About what happens now. About how we move forward from this." "Forward?" I turned to face her. "Mira, you shared company secrets with Pierce Eldrow for 8 months. You compromised business operations, cost the company millions in revenue, and violated every principle of professional ethics. What exactly are we moving forward to?" She sat down at the kitchen table, and I could see her hands shaking slightly. "I made mistakes, I know that. But the way you handled this, the public humiliation, the complete destruction of my career, it was vindictive. It was business. It was personal, and you know it." I turned off the stove and sat down across from her. Time for the conversation we should have had months ago. "When did it start, Mira? The personal relationship with Pierce?" She looked at her hands. "There was no personal relationship. We worked together. We discussed projects. Sometimes those discussions happened outside the office. I have 8 months of text messages that tell a different story. Text messages you obtained through illegal surveillance. Legal monitoring systems that are part of company security protocols. Systems that every employee, including you, agreed to as a condition of employment." She looked up at me with something approaching anger. "You spied on me?" "I monitored company communications for security breaches. The fact that those communications revealed your personal involvement with Pierce is incidental." "Incidental," she shook her head. "Lennon, I was your wife. We'd been married for 15 years, and you were monitoring my communications like I was a criminal. You were sharing confidential information with unauthorized personnel. That makes you exactly like a criminal." The words hung between us like a physical barrier. Mira's expression shifted from anger to something that looked like recognition. "You really don't care about the marriage at all, do you? This is all just business to you." I considered the question. 3 days ago, I might have tried to separate the personal and professional aspects to find some way to salvage the relationship while addressing the business violations. But sitting across from Mira now, looking at someone who had systematically betrayed both personal and professional trust, I realized the distinction was meaningless. "The marriage ended when you started sharing our business with Pierce Eldrow. Everything since then has been just cleaning up the paperwork." She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I never meant for it to go this far." "What did you mean for it to be?" "Pierce was attentive, interested in my opinions, my insights about the business. He made me feel valued in ways that you hadn't for years." "So you decided to give him confidential information?" "I decided to have conversations with someone who appreciated my professional knowledge. The information sharing wasn't intentional." 8 months of systematic briefings about executive decisions weren't intentional? She looked at me with frustration. "You don't understand what it was like. Pierce would ask about my day, about the projects I was working on, about the challenges the company was facing. It felt like normal professional discussion." Normal professional discussion doesn't include executive compensation reviews and merger negotiations. I know that now. You knew it then, Mira. You just chose to ignore it because Pierce was giving you attention. The silence stretched between us. Outside, I could hear traffic passing on the street, normal evening sounds from a world that hadn't been turned upside down by corporate espionage and marital betrayal. "What happens now?" she asked finally. I pulled a manila envelope from the counter and slid it across the table. "Divorce papers. I filed this morning." She opened the envelope and scanned the documents. "You're asking for everything." "I'm asking for what I'm entitled to. The house is in my name, purchased with income from Brasken Holdings. The investment accounts are separate property. The only joint assets are checking accounts and household items." "What about spousal support?" You violated the prenuptial agreement by engaging in activities that damaged my business interests. No spousal support. She stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Lennon, I have no job, no income, no prospects. The industry won't hire me after this scandal. You should have considered that before you started briefing Pierce Eldrow about company operations. This is vindictive. This is consequences. She closed the envelope and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not sadness, but something like recognition of fundamental change. I'll need time to find an attorney to review the terms. Take all the time you need, but understand that the terms aren't negotiable. You compromised my business for personal reasons. Now you get to rebuild your life without the benefits of that business. Mira stood up and walked toward the door, then turned back. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. About Pierce, about the information sharing, about all of it. I'm sure you are. Are you? Sorry, I mean. I thought about the question. Was I sorry that my marriage had ended? Sorry that someone I'd trusted had betrayed that trust? Sorry that personal and professional relationships had become so complicated? I'm sorry it took me so long to figure out what was really happening. She nodded and left. I finished making dinner and ate alone, reviewing the divorce documents and considering the next steps. The professional aspects were nearly complete, Pierce's career destroyed, Riverside facing bankruptcy, regulatory investigations underway. The personal reckoning was just beginning, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward instead of trying to solve problems I didn't fully understand. The marriage was over, the business was secure, and Pierce Eldrow was about to learn that some mistakes have permanent consequences. Thursday morning, I drove to the company offices for the first time since the scandal broke. The building looked the same from the outside, glass and steel reflecting the gray sky, professional landscaping, the kind of corporate architecture that suggests competence and stability, but inside, everything had changed. Morrison met me in the lobby, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 4 days. The staff is on edge, he said as we walked toward the elevators. Half of them are worried about job security, the other half are asking questions about the monitoring systems. What kind of questions? Whether their communications are being recorded, whether their personal activities are under surveillance, whether they can trust management. I wasn't surprised. Corporate espionage investigations tend to make everyone nervous about privacy and security. What did you tell them? That the monitoring systems are standard security protocols focused on protecting company information. That personal activities aren't relevant unless they involve sharing confidential data with unauthorized parties. The elevator doors opened and we stepped inside. Morrison pressed the button for the executive floor. The board wants to discuss your role going forward, he said. What kind of role? Interim CEO. The company needs visible leadership while we rebuild confidence and address the operational damage from Pierce's information sharing. I'd been expecting this conversation. With Pierce gone and Mira terminated, the company was missing 2 senior staff members and facing questions about management stability. I'm not interested in day-to-day operations. You wouldn't need to handle routine management. We'd bring in an operations director to manage daily business, but the board thinks having the majority owner in a visible leadership position would reassure clients and staff. The elevator opened onto the executive floor. Pierce's corner office was already empty, his personal items removed, and his access credentials deactivated. The space looked sterile and abandoned. What about the regulatory investigation? Lisa Park says having you in an official leadership role would actually strengthen the company's position. It demonstrates that ownership is taking direct responsibility for information security. We walked past Pierce's empty office toward the conference room where the board was waiting. Through the windows, I could see staff members at their desks, working but clearly distracted by the ongoing uncertainty. One condition, I said as we reached the conference room door. What? I want comprehensive forensic auditing of all company systems, communications, and financial records. If there are other security breaches or questionable activities, I want them identified and addressed immediately. That's expensive and time-consuming. It's necessary. This company is going to operate with complete transparency and accountability, or it's going to be sold to someone who will ensure those standards. Morrison nodded grimly and opened the conference room door. The board meeting lasted 2 hours. We discussed operational continuity, client retention, staff morale, and regulatory compliance. By the end, I'd accepted the interim CEO position with full authority to implement security protocols and operational changes. At 2 p.m., I called an all-staff meeting in the main conference room. 43 employees gathered, representing everyone from senior project managers to administrative assistants. The mood was tense and uncertain, exactly what I'd expected after 4 days of scandal and leadership upheaval. I'm sure you all have questions about recent events, I began. I want to address those questions directly and explain what happens next. I spent 20 minutes outlining the facts. Pierce Eldrow's information sharing with Riverside Development Group, the financial damage to company operations, the regulatory investigation, and the termination of personnel involved in the security breach. Some of you may be concerned about job security or company stability. Let me be clear. This company has strong financial backing, solid client relationships, and excellent staff. The actions of two individuals don't change those fundamentals. A project manager raised her hand. What about the monitoring systems? Are our personal communications being recorded? Company communications are monitored for security purposes, as outlined in your employment agreements. Personal activities aren't relevant unless they involve sharing confidential company information with unauthorized parties. But how do we know the monitoring won't be used against us for other reasons? It was a fair question, and one that deserved a direct answer. Because I'm implementing an independent oversight system. All monitoring activities will be reviewed by external auditors to ensure they're focused solely on information security. Any employee who believes the systems are being misused can report concerns directly to the board without retaliation. The questions continued for another 30 minutes. Staff concerns about privacy, job security, client relationships, and company direction. I answered everything as directly as possible, emphasizing transparency and accountability. One final point, I said as the meeting concluded. This company operates on trust. Trust between management and staff, trust between the company and clients, trust within the industry. That trust was violated by individuals who put personal interests ahead of professional responsibilities. We're going to rebuild that trust through consistent actions and complete transparency. After the meeting, I moved into the interim CEO office and began reviewing operational reports. The company was financially stable, but facing challenges from lost contracts and damaged industry relationships. Rebuilding would take time and consistent performance. At 4 p.m., my assistant knocked on the door. "There's a call for you, Pierce Eldrow." I stared at her for a moment. Pierce calling the company he'd just been terminated from for corporate espionage. "Put him through." Pierce's voice was strained and desperate. "Lennon, we need to talk." "About what?" "About resolving this situation. About finding a way forward that doesn't destroy everyone involved." "Everyone involved destroyed themselves, Pierce. I just documented it." "Look, I know I made mistakes. I know the information sharing was inappropriate. But this federal investigation, the criminal charges, the complete destruction of my career, it's excessive. It's proportional to 18 months of systematic corporate espionage." "It wasn't espionage. It was poor judgment about professional boundaries." I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Pierce Eldrow was making phone calls from whatever temporary shelter he'd found, trying to negotiate his way out of consequences he'd spent months creating. "Pierce, you traded company secrets for competitive advantage. You cost us millions in revenue and damaged our industry relationships. You conspired with a competitor to manipulate market conditions. Those aren't judgment errors. What would it take to make this go away? Nothing. The regulatory investigation is out of my hands. The industry reputation damage is permanent. Your career is over." "Lennon, please." I hung up. By 5 p.m., I'd reviewed the operational reports, met with senior staff, and begun implementing the forensic auditing systems that would ensure this kind of security breach never happened again. The corner office felt different than I'd expected. Not triumphant or satisfying, just necessary. Like a job that needed to be done by someone willing to do it properly. Pierce Eldrow's career was finished. Mira's professional reputation was destroyed. Riverside Development Group was facing bankruptcy. And I was sitting in a corner office running a company that had been nearly destroyed by people who confused personal attention with professional loyalty. The revenge was complete, comprehensive, and absolutely legal. But as I looked out at the city lights beginning to flicker on in the evening darkness, I realized this wasn't really about revenge at all. It was about consequences. And consequences, unlike revenge, don't end when you feel satisfied. They just continue day after day until everyone involved learns to live with the choices they made. Pierce Eldrow was about to learn that lesson in ways he never imagined, and so was I.